So my name is Ashley Boomgarden, and this is my informative speech on voting. I have my audience here on Skype or FaceTime. Had to get a little bit creative. Everyone in my household is gone tonight, so they're going to be my audience, and I will get started. Our forefathers fought for it. Women, African Americans, Native Americans, and other minority groups fought for it. Voting is one of the core principles our nation was built on. It's important that we understand how the voting process worked in the past, how it works now, and how it could potentially work in the future, since it is such a founding principle of our nation. So that's what I will be speaking about today, and there are two things that have changed the most that I would like to focus on, and that's voting demographics and voting methods. And starting with the first election, George Washington was unanimously voted president in 1789. He is the only president in history to be unanimously voted in. There was no campaigning for the first election, and the person with the second most votes became the vice president. So it was different than the elections you see today, where the presidential candidate will select his running mate to become vice president. Only 1.3% of the population voted, according to AEI.org, and only 6 states allowed popular voting at all. The rest simply let their legislation choose their electorates to go to the Electoral College. And the Electoral College was made up of 10 states. There were a few that chose not to send electorates for the Electoral College. And in addition to that, the actual voting demographics of those few that could vote, slaves weren't allowed to vote, women were not allowed to vote, and even many white men were disqualified because of land ownership requirements. So there were a lot of hoops to jump through, which led to an extremely low popular voter turnout. In addition to the fact that only 6 states allowed it at all. And after that, demographics didn't change a whole lot. Methods changed, obviously, and advanced as more states were added to the United States. The Electoral College got bigger. Methods changed a bit, but demographics didn't change too much until around the 1870s, when African Americans gained the right to vote. So the amendment was passed in 1870, but there were things like literacy tests and other barriers that still prevented them from voting. You'll see here there's a poll tax law, and then there's also a literacy test from Louisiana. And so those two things, among others, prevented African Americans from voting additionally. And it wasn't until 1965 that federal law interfered and changed the laws and said, no, you can't use these literacy tests to prevent them from voting. This was called the Voting Rights Act, and it prohibited discrimination by race in addition to discrimination by language barriers, which in addition to African Americans helped out other minority groups like Native Americans and Asian Americans who also didn't speak the language well. And African American voting has come a long way. At the end of the 1950s, 45% of the Mississippi population was African American, but only 5% was registered to vote, and Mississippi, in addition, had one of the highest lynching rates of any of the states. But now, in a recent election in 2008, when Barack Obama was elected president, non-Hispanic whites and African Americans had the highest level voter turnout among any group, according to the United States Census. So they have come a long way, and then the other group that has made major headway in the voting department is women. Women's suffrage was a very long movement, and it wasn't always focused on voting, but the amendment that introduced the idea that women would be allowed to vote was introduced in 1878, but it was not ratified until 1920. And the women's suffrage movement as a whole started out with really wide goals. They had a lot of things that they wanted to accomplish, but eventually they all kind of focused on this fight for women's voting rights. Unfortunately for women, politics was going through a period of change itself, right at around the time that they earned the right to vote. The progressive area was in a decline after World War I, which prevented them from using their newfound voice and their newfound voting rights to make any sort of social change. There was also a national decline in voter turnout as a whole. According to history art archives from the U.S. House of Representatives, everyone was not voting. There was a decline overall, rather, not just in women's group, but in overall population of America, there was a decline. But in addition, women were voting way below what they were expected to, and even when they did vote, their views still mirrored that of their husbands or their fathers or the other men in their household. They weren't voting on their own opinions. They were voting in a way that mimicked the men in their households. So that didn't change for quite some time either, but that was just the way it was. And then as far as methods go, the gear and lever voting machine was in full swing at this time. I have a couple ads from the gear and lever voting machine on the screen behind me. And basically what the gear and lever voting machine did was you would select your candidates and then pull a lever and it would submit your vote. So that was the main method that they had at the time. And that pretty much brings us into the present, and I wanted to talk about the 2016 presidential election in particular. This election has brought us two very polarizing candidates, more so than we've seen in recent years, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. So that has been changing demographics. It's been changing kind of the way that politics are talked about, and in addition to that changing it, technology is also changing the game big time as well. From live stream debates to celebrity voting campaigns, and even Facebook had a registration tool on their website where you could register to vote straight from Facebook. So it's things like that technology is really changing the way that people can vote, people hear about voting, the way that voting is influenced. And even the way that candidates talk to the voters is different now. Donald Trump has 12.7 million Twitter followers, and that's something that we haven't really seen before, where candidates are able to speak so directly with the people. So I think that's something that's changing as well, and I think that's something that will continue to change. Voting has come a long way in the past 100 years, and I think it will only continue to change in the next 100. There's really no way for us to know how it's going to look different. We can guess, but I'm sure that there were guesses 100 years ago that were proven incorrect as well. So I think that's why it's important to look back. As I previously mentioned, voting is one of the core principles that this nation was built on, and I think that it's important to know how it worked and get to know who fought so hard for it and why it's so important that everyone takes advantage of their right to vote.